Act 2, Catalyst for Conversation, the power and impotence of ideas. I was first asked whether impotence is just a spelling mistake and it should mean the importance of ideas, and I hate to say no, it's not a spelling mistake. The second act is really about what ideas do and how important ideas are to get an idea off the ground, a project off the ground, but then also when you have to let ideas go because other things become more important and the local version of the idea, the local translation, becomes more valuable than the original.
I think what's very interesting about this is the marriage of the Scottish government with contemporary ideas about how you lead innovation. So particularly Mariana Mazzucato's work on mission-led innovation, and bringing in the private sector into the conversation, most notably through Benny Higgins.
Yeah, so Mariana had presented to the Council of Economic Advisors and the First Minister on the whole idea of a development bank and mission-led investment. And so that was the original catalyst for the conversation at government about creating a national investment bank. And so that took place around the late summer of 2017. And Mariana was part of the implementation working group that I chaired. So she was very important in the sense that it was her idea that sparked what that took place thereafter. And in many ways the bank is still very aligned to her ideas. But she wasn't involved beyond the implementation plan. But that was definitely the catalyst, for sure.
I mean, Mariana was known to Benny as a result of her involvement as a member of the Scottish Council of Economic Advisors. And so that was one of the, whilst Benny wasn't given any kind of predetermined outcomes for the project, he was encouraged that you should speak to Mariana, which I think was probably a bit of a kind of a nod to this sort of organisation that the First Minister really wanted out of this. You know, she didn't want to create a, very kind of, she didn't want to create a private equity vehicle that would try and invest money into the economy. She wanted something that, I guess, had a real sense of purpose. And I think that's, in all credit to her, and might seem like a long-winded answer, but in all credit to her, what you're seeing now in the business community is a real orientation towards purposeful led organisations. And that for me is exactly what, was the kind of, the very entity of what a mission-led bank was all about.
I think the first thing to learn is that when you launch something like this, people expect it to have altruistic motives. But for the bank to be self-sufficient and be something that, in generations to come, the country can be proud of and has helped the economic development of the country, there needs to be a realization that it's not a grant giver. Grants don't work anymore. This is an institution that's going to invest in businesses and social enterprises that are able to contribute to the economic growth and contribute to the missions that have been set for the bank.
On one hand, you have a view that investment is just about realising economic return, if you will, the Homo economicus view of the world. On the other hand, you have a view that the state is there to intervene, to possibly in counter-economic cyclical times, to boost investment, to create jobs. Now, the investment community is generally looking for short to medium-term investments. What we know about grand challenges is they require significant investment over long periods of time. So I think what this National Investment Bank can do is to provide what Benny Higgins would characterise as patient capital.
In that room you had Mariana on one side, who was the fierce global academic in this subject, and then you also had Alan McFarlane, who was, a huge supporter of organisations that we were trying to create. He had previously worked for the predecessor to 3i, so he'd actually worked in a state-led organisation that was going to operate in a similar way. But he was also, a very kind of hardened and well-run businessman, and so he was able to say, well, that's not going to work in reality. So, I think that that kind of tension was, I guess, what enabled Benny to make sure that, one, he was kind of sticking to the kind of guiding principles that he was very keen to create from the start, but then also knowing that, you know, he was able to create something that was going to be practical and real.
There are tensions between what a market logic, what finance capital might want, and a state national investment bank. And I think the way to work it is in terms of creating a hybrid, such that you have patient capital, but you're also only backing ideas that you think are good ideas and likely to yield some return.
So the idea is a good vessel, it's a good vehicle to, you know, start the conversation, to invite people around the table. But at one point it has to become a Scottish idea, and it has to land on the local table, and it has to make sense in a local context. And I think he was pragmatic in a sense that he could let go and said at one point it's actually not about being faithful to whoever, you know, coined the phrase of a national investment bank. It is important to do our own version. So we have to deviate from the original, if you want. And that is totally okay, because we have to find our own version, our own kind of voice in the mix. I know that Benny is quite interested in translation, so translating languages from one to the other. And since I'm not a native speaker, as you picked up by now, it is kind of, I'm quite interested in that as well. So, you know, how do you say something in one language and how do you say it in another language? And it is interesting because, so the theory of translation, you know, you would never get anywhere if you wanted to be accurate, right? If you really wanted to say something in German and then you want to say exactly the same thing in English, you actually have to deviate from the original. You have to think about, well, they're different metaphors. So if I want to express the same feeling, if I want to get the same effect in the audience, I have to say it in a different way. So it's an interesting paradox here. To be faithful, you actually have to change the original quite a bit. And if you translate it word by word, you wouldn't do a favor to the original. So it's kind of an interesting mechanism of thinking about change. So to use translation as an idea where you say the original has to change in order for you to stay truthful to the original version. That is what translation does. And I think that's very much what he did with the idea of a national investment bank. So take the original and translate it into a local context where it could land and where it could grow and where it could make sense to local stakeholders. So he was very pragmatic in this respect.
Benny and I went to meet with Mariana and her kind of colleague who was part of the advisory group as well, Laurie McFarlane, down at the University College of London, and she kind of spoke at Benny in she's got a wonderful style, Mariana, and she kind of spoke at Benny for about an hour, and I think he was blown away by not only her enthusiasm but also her, you know, real drive for purity. So, you know, I think she believes that in order to be successful, a mission-orientated bank couldn't cut corners and needed to be kind of here. And so I think he found that just wonderful and immediately asked her to be on the advisory group. And what he had done through that advisory group was create a degree of tension. And that tension was extremely helpful in terms of, you know, getting the bank to, you know, I guess be as an effective an institution as it possibly could be. And that means, you know, having people from both sides of the aisle really in terms of, you know, the kind of theoretical outcome, but against the kind of, you know, what would be the practical application of the organisation, and that's kind of where, you know, Benny's own style and his independence was so helpful as well, because Benny wasn't kind of driven by I guess a kind of ideological view of the organisation. He was kind of driven by, well, how can we make something that is as successful as possible, and also do it in a time frame that, you know, we need to actually start affecting change.
You know, within the bank itself, I think it's more, it's less about ideas and it's more about ambition. It's very easy to squander away £200 million on just keeping SMEs in debt or in equity. You know, it's the British Business Bank provides a lot of funding. We would complement that. I think this is really more about trying to look at what's going to give a bit of a shift in the way that these businesses operate collectively and within the sector and within the market that they operate. And how do we make sure that that goes towards the missions that we have? So one of the things, which is a small idea or a small implementation, is the conditionality associated with some of the investments. We're saying, you know, Scotland wants to be a fairer place of work. So if you're going to get investment from the bank, we're going to, depending on what level it is, I mean, we wouldn't if it was £100,000, but say we're going to give you £10 million of equity investment, and you have no diversity on your board at all, and you haven't signed up to the fair wages charters that exist, and you haven't got an eco policy, then those are things that are going to have to change.
Now, in the implementation of an idea, what we know from management theory is in the process of implementing an idea, it always changes. So different people put their signature on it, and an idea doesn't turn up in a new destination in the same state that it departed. So basically, what we have, I think, is the Mariana Mazzucato's very interesting ideas on mission-led innovation, and then we have Benny Higgins tailoring them and turning them into a blueprint for the Scottish National Investment Bank. So if you will, a generative dance between the ideas from Mariana Mazzucato and then looking at that pragmatically in terms of how do we design an institution for the future. So a fascinating interaction.
I think the second key lesson that you can learn from Benny's story is the power of ideas. And as academic, I'm of course really fond of that story, but it is also a story that tells you when you have to let ideas go, and when ideas kind of travel into reality and they start having a life on their own and they develop into something quite different than what they originally were. So maybe sometimes authenticity and sticking to the original idea is not all that important. Maybe sometimes it's about making an idea work in a specific context. So here we start with a very strong idea of a national investment bank, an idea that has been tested in various different contexts. Benny took that idea, and at the beginning it was really important to kind of lead with that idea, so to get people hooked into the project. But then, as the story unfolds, the idea kind of becomes more of a tool that kind of gets a lot of people involved in the conversation, and it becomes a very Scottish version of the idea. So that process of translation is really important, and I think we see with SNIB, we see how that process unfolds live. That's really interesting.